They threw the first stone at my head. The second one hit my shoulder. By the fifth rock that struck my back, I knew I was going to die. But I also knew something else. I knew that the Jesus I had just accepted into my heart would never abandon me, even in that pit of death. The taste of dirt mixed with blood filled my mouth as they continued to rain stones down on me. My father, the man who had taught me to walk, who had kissed my scraped knees when I was 5, stood at the front of that crowd, holding the largest rock. His eyes, which once looked at me with pride when I recited the Quran perfectly, now burned with a hatred so intense I could feel it through the pain. I was buried alive that day. Not metaphorically. Literally. Dirt was shoveled over my broken body as the last few stones found their mark. The weight of the earth pressed against my chest, making each breath a desperate fight. In that darkness, with my ribs cracked and my skull fractured, I should have died. Every law of medicine said I would die. Every person who walked away from that pit believed I was dead. But here I stand before you today, breathing, alive, whole. And I'm going to tell you exactly how I got from that grave to this platform, because what happened in between defies every explanation except one: the miraculous power of Jesus Christ. My name is Maha, and 27 years ago, I made a decision that my entire family, my community, my religion said deserved death. I chose to follow Jesus. What followed was a journey through hell itself, but it led me to discover a love so powerful, so transformative, that it literally raised me from the dead. This is not a story you'll hear in the news. This is not a story that made headlines. This happened in the shadows, in secret places where honor is more valuable than life, where family reputation is worth more than a daughter's blood. This is the story of how a Muslim girl died and a Christian woman was born, in the same hour, in the same pit, under the same stones meant to silence me forever. But before I was buried in that desert pit, before I felt the first stone crack against my skull, before my father looked me in the eyes and declared me dead to our family, there was another life. There was a girl who believed everything she was taught, who prayed 5 times a day without question, who wore her hijab with pride and memorized scripture with devotion. That girl was me. And her story begins in a house where the call to prayer echoed 5 times daily, where the Quran was the only truth, and where love came with conditions that would eventually demand my life as payment. You need to understand where I came from to understand the weight of what I left behind. You need to see the family that raised me to comprehend the magnitude of what they were willing to do when I betrayed everything they held sacred. Because this isn't just a story about religious conversion. This is a story about what happens when love collides with law, when grace challenges tradition, when one woman's relationship with Jesus threatens an entire community's understanding of honor. So, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you the little girl who would grow up to defy everything she was taught, who would trade paradise as she knew it for a cross she'd never seen, who would choose death over denial and discover that sometimes, death is just the doorway to real life. I was born into what outsiders would call privilege, but what I knew as prison. My father, Hakim, wasn't just any imam. He was the most respected religious leader in our region. When he spoke, grown men listened with trembling hearts. When he entered a room, conversation stopped. When he prayed, his voice carried such authority that people would gather outside our home just to hear the words flow from his lips. Our house sat at the center of our village like a fortress of faith. 5 times a day, the sound of prayer rolled through every room, every corridor, every corner where a child might try to hide. There was no escape from worship, no moment when we were not being observed, evaluated, measured against the perfect standard my father represented to our community. My mother, Zara, moved through our home like a ghost, present but silent, devoted but fearful. She had learned long ago that her voice was meant for prayer, not opinion. Her hands were for service, not for reaching beyond what was permitted. She loved us fiercely, but her love was wrapped in such caution, such terror of bringing shame upon our family name, that even her embraces felt like warnings. The strict religious household demanded perfection. Deviation meant punishment. We began 5 daily prayers at age 6, with beatings for missed prayers becoming as regular as meals. I was memorizing Quranic verses, 50 verses by age 8, entire chapters by 12. Special treatment as the imam's daughter meant community respect mixed with complete isolation. Religious pride and family honor concepts controlled every breath we took. We were 7 children in total, 4 brothers and 3 sisters. I was the middle daughter, which meant I was old enough to understand what was expected, but young enough to still question why. My older brother, Tariq, had already been chosen to follow father's footsteps. At 17, he led prayers when father traveled, and his eyes had developed that same cold certainty I saw in father's gaze. My younger siblings learned quickly to watch my face during father's sermons, to read my expressions as warnings of what not to ask, what not to wonder about. Because questions in our house weren't just discouraged, they were evidence of spiritual weakness, signs that Shaitan himself was whispering poison into young hearts. My sisters and I shared one room, 3 beds pushed together, so tightly we could hear each other breathe at night. Jamila, 2 years older than me, had perfected the art of invisible existence. She spoke only when spoken to, moved through the house like morning mist, and had trained her face to show nothing, no curiosity, no doubt, no trace of the thoughts I knew must be racing through her mind. Salma, my younger sister, still had light in her eyes at 12, but I could already see it dimming as the weight of our expectations pressed down on her small shoulders. My father Hakim was our community's religious authority, an intimidating presence with zero tolerance for deviation. Mother Zara remained submissive, fearful, protective, but completely powerless. My brothers consisted of Tariq the eldest, who was following father's path, and Zaid the youngest, who was still forming his beliefs. My sisters included Jamila, who was completely compliant and feared everything, while Salma was younger and watching her innocence fade daily. I was exactly 12 years and 4 months old when I first questioned whether Allah loved me. It was a Thursday evening in winter, and the call to Maghrib prayer had just finished echoing through our courtyard. My sister Jamila had been caught speaking to our Christian neighbor, Miriam, about her sick baby. Just speaking. Just showing human compassion for a mother's fear. What happened next is burned into my memory with such clarity that I can still smell the fear in the air, still hear the sound of leather striking skin, still see the way my mother's hands shook as she held the basin of water to clean Jamila's wounds afterward. My father didn't just beat her. He methodically explained, with each strike, why associating with infidels was worse than theft, worse than lying, worse than any earthly crime. Their unbelief is contagious, he said as the belt fell. Their sympathy is poison, he continued as my sister's blood began to stain the kitchen floor. Your tears for their suffering shows you love them more than Allah, he finished as Jamila collapsed, unconscious from pain. I stood in the doorway, hidden in shadow, watching my father pray over my sister's broken body, thanking Allah for giving him the strength to correct his daughter's wayward heart. And in that moment, as I watched blood pool beneath someone I loved, a thought entered my mind that I knew I could never speak aloud. If Allah requires this, if God demands that we show no mercy to others who are suffering, then maybe I don't understand who God really is. That night, while Jamila wept silently in the bed next to mine, I stared at the ceiling and wondered what kind of God would be pleased by her tears. But I was 12 years old, and doubt was not an option in our house. So I buried that question deep in my heart and tried to forget it ever occurred to me. I couldn't have known that buried questions have a way of growing in the dark, taking root in places you never expected, until one day they push through the surface and change everything you thought you believed about the world. The years between 12 and 16 passed like a slow-burning fire in my chest. Every day brought new rules, new restrictions, new reminders of how a proper Muslim daughter should behave. I learned to lower my eyes when men spoke, to speak only when asked direct questions, to find my identity completely within the boundaries my father had drawn around our family's reputation. But that buried question kept growing, sending out roots that touched every area of my life. When I saw our neighbor Miriam's kindness to strangers, when I watched her tend to sick animals with gentle hands, when I observed how her children played freely in their courtyard, laughing without fear of punishment, I couldn't help but compare the fruit of her faith with the fear that dominated our home. At 14, I began to notice things I had never seen before. The way my father's sermons always focused on what was forbidden, never on what brought joy. The way the men in our mosque spoke of Allah's wrath, but rarely mentioned His mercy. The way women in our community seemed to shrink into themselves year by year, as if devotion required them to become smaller, quieter, less visible with each passing season. I watched my own mother disappear a little more each day, her laughter becoming a memory, her opinions fading into silent agreement with whatever father declared to be truth. When I turned 16, everything changed. My father made a decision that would eventually lead to both my salvation and my near death. He decided I should attend university. Not because he believed in women's education, but because he wanted me to become a teacher of Islamic studies for women. He had grand plans for me to spread his particular interpretation of faith, to become a scholar who would bring honor to our family name through religious achievement. He saw my intelligence as a tool for God's glory, never imagining it might become the very thing that would lead me away from everything he held sacred. The university opened a world I never knew existed. For the first time in my life, I sat in rooms with people who thought differently, believed differently, questioned everything I had been taught to accept without examination. My Islamic studies program was rigorous, demanding that I memorize not just the Quran but also countless hadith, commentaries, and theological arguments. But the more I studied, the more questions arose that our professors either couldn't answer or refused to discuss. Why did Allah's mercy seem to be conditional when the Quran claimed it was infinite? Why were women's testimonies worth half that of men if we were truly equal in God's eyes? Why did Islamic law seem to punish doubt rather than encourage honor-seeking? It was during my second semester that I met Nadia, a girl from a Christian family who had somehow gained admission to our Islamic studies program. She was studying comparative religion, she explained, trying to understand different faiths better. At first, I was suspicious of her motives. My father's teachings had prepared me to view Christians as either deluded or deceptive, people who had corrupted the original message that Allah had given to Jesus. But Nadia didn't match anything I had been told to expect. She was respectful during our Quranic discussions, asked thoughtful questions, and never tried to argue against our beliefs. Instead, she listened with genuine curiosity, taking notes as if she truly wanted to understand what we believed and why. Slowly, carefully, we began to have conversations that went beyond the classroom. During study breaks, over shared meals in the university cafeteria, in quiet corners of the library, Nadia would ask questions that no one had ever asked me before. Not challenges, but genuine inquiries about how my faith worked in my daily life. How did I experience Allah's love? What brought me joy in my relationship with God? How did I reconcile the commands for mercy with the harsh punishments prescribed for various sins? These weren't attacks on my beliefs, but invitations to examine what I actually believed versus what I had been told to believe. For months, I deflected her questions or gave the standard answers I had been taught. But privately, I began to notice that my responses felt hollow, like words I was reciting rather than truths I had discovered. When Nadia talked about her faith, there was something different in her voice. She spoke of Jesus, not as a distant prophet, but as someone she knew personally. She described prayer not as obligation, but as conversation with a friend. She talked about God's love as something she felt daily, not something she had to earn through perfect obedience. One afternoon, as we sat studying in the library, Nadia quietly pulled a small book from her bag. It was a Bible, worn and marked with notes in the margins. She didn't offer it to me or suggest I read it. She simply opened it and began reading silently while I worked on my Islamic jurisprudence assignment. But I couldn't concentrate. I kept glancing at the book, wondering what was written there that could make someone's face glow with such peace while reading. Finally, I couldn't resist asking, what was she reading that brought her such obvious joy? She smiled and turned the book so I could see the page. It was open to the Gospel of John, chapter 8, where Jesus was speaking to some religious leaders. She read aloud, quietly, so only I could hear. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. The words hit me like lightning. All my life, I had been told that truth was what my father taught, what the imam proclaimed, what centuries of Islamic scholars had determined was correct. But this verse suggested that truth was something I could know personally, something that would bring freedom rather than more restrictions. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those words. The truth will set you free. What if truth wasn't just a list of beliefs to memorize and rules to follow? What if truth was something alive, something that could be known and experienced? What if I had been seeking truth in the wrong place all along? The next day, I asked Nadia if I could borrow her Bible. Just to compare, I told her. Just to understand the differences between what Christians and Muslims believed about Jesus. She handed it to me without hesitation, with no strings attached, no pressure to reach any particular conclusion. Take as long as you need, she said simply. And pray while you read, if you're comfortable doing that. Ask God to show you what's true. I hid the Bible inside my Islamic theology textbook and began the most dangerous reading of my life. Every night, after completing my required prayers and Quranic recitation, I would secretly read passages from this forbidden book. What I found there challenged everything I thought I knew about God, about Jesus, about the nature of divine love. The Jesus of the Gospels was nothing like the distant prophet I had been taught to revere. This Jesus touched lepers, defended adulterers, ate with tax collectors and sinners. He spoke to women as equals, forgave people before they asked for forgiveness, and claimed authority to do things that only God could do. But it was more than just the stories that affected me. As I read, I began to feel something I had never experienced in all my years of Islamic devotion. Peace. Not the temporary peace that comes from completing religious obligations, but a deep, lasting sense that I was finally hearing from the God I had been searching for my entire life. When Jesus said things like, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest," I felt as if he was speaking directly to me, calling me by name, inviting me into a relationship I hadn't even known was possible. For months, I lived this double life. Muslim daughter by day, secret seeker by night. I continued to pray 5 times daily, to attend mosque services, to recite the Shahada with my family. But my heart was engaged in a completely different conversation. I was falling in love with a God who seemed to love me back without condition, without the constant fear of punishment that had dominated my spiritual life since childhood. The contrast became impossible to ignore. When I read the Quran, I found commands and warnings, rules and restrictions. When I read the Bible, I found invitations and promises, grace and unconditional love. When I prayed as a Muslim, I felt I was reporting to a distant master who was evaluating my performance. When I prayed as Nadia had taught me, speaking to God through Jesus, I felt I was talking to a father who was genuinely interested in my thoughts, my fears, my hopes, my heart. But knowing something in your heart and acting on it are 2 different things entirely. I knew that if my family discovered my interest in Christianity, the consequences would be severe. Honor killings might be rare in our community, but they weren't unknown. Religious apostasy was considered the ultimate family shame, worse than any crime, deserving of complete rejection and potentially violent punishment. So I continued living in secret, growing in my new faith while maintaining the appearance of devout Islamic belief. This double life might have continued indefinitely if not for one pivotal night during Ramadan of my 2nd year at university. It was the 27th night, believed to be Laylat al-Qadr, the night of power, when Muslims believed the Quran was first revealed. Our entire family had gathered for intense prayer and Quranic recitation that would continue until dawn. I was leading the women in prayer, reciting verses I had memorized years earlier, when suddenly the words felt completely foreign in my mouth. I was speaking Arabic phrases about Allah's greatness, while my heart was crying out to Jesus for peace. I was reciting verses about submission and fear while my soul was yearning for the unconditional love I had discovered in the Gospels. In that moment, I realized I couldn't continue living this contradiction. Either Jesus was who he claimed to be, the Son of God, the way to the Father, the truth that sets people free, or he wasn't. Either Christianity was true, and I needed to embrace it fully, or it was false, and I needed to abandon it completely. There was no middle ground, no way to worship both Allah and Jesus, no compromise between submission-based faith and grace-based relationship. After the family prayers ended and everyone had gone to bed, I snuck out to our rooftop garden. Under the stars, surrounded by the silence of a sleeping village, I knelt down and made the most important decision of my life. I prayed, not facing Mecca as I had been trained, but looking up to heaven as I had learned from watching Nadia. Jesus, I whispered into the darkness, if you are truly the Son of God, if you died for my sins and rose from the dead, if you are the way to the Father as you claim to be, then I want to follow you. I don't care what it costs me. I don't care what I have to give up. I want to know the truth, and I want to be free. What happened next is difficult to describe in words. It wasn't a vision or a voice from heaven, but it was unmistakably real. I felt surrounded by love. Not the conditional love I had known from my family, not the distant mercy I had been taught about Allah, but a personal, overwhelming, transformative love that seemed to fill every empty place in my heart. I felt forgiven for sins I hadn't even recognized, accepted in ways I had never experienced, welcomed into a family I hadn't known existed. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. I stayed on that rooftop until dawn, crying and praying and experiencing what I now know was the new birth Jesus talks about in the Gospels. When I finally went back to my room, I was a different person. Maha, the dutiful Muslim daughter, still existed on the outside, but inside, I had become someone completely new, a Christian, a daughter of the living God, a follower of Jesus Christ. For 6 months, I managed to keep my conversion secret while my faith grew stronger every day. Nadia introduced me to a small group of Christian women who met weekly for Bible study and prayer. They welcomed me with such joy, celebrating my decision to follow Jesus as if it was their own victory. For the first time in my life, I was part of a community where questions were encouraged, where doubt was met with patient explanation rather than punishment, where love was the motivation for obedience rather than fear. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially secrets as life-changing as mine. I began to change in ways I couldn't hide. The anger that had always simmered beneath my compliance started to disappear. The fear that had motivated most of my religious observance was replaced by genuine joy. The rigid perfection I had always strived for gave way to a relaxed confidence in God's grace. My family began to notice that something was different, even though I was still performing all my Islamic duties exactly as before. It was my youngest brother, Zaid, who discovered the truth. He was 16, still trying to earn father's approval by being the perfect Muslim son. He had developed a habit of watching all of us for any signs of spiritual weakness that he could report to gain favor. One evening, as I was preparing for bed, I thought everyone was asleep. I pulled out the Bible that I now kept hidden under my mattress and began reading by candlelight. I was so absorbed in the story of Jesus healing the woman with the issue of blood that I didn't hear footsteps in the hallway. I didn't notice the shadow in the doorway. I didn't realize I was being watched until Zaid spoke. "Sister, what is that book you're reading?" His voice was quiet, but there was something in his tone that made my blood freeze. I quickly closed the Bible and tried to hide it, but it was too late. He had seen enough to recognize what it was. His eyes widened with shock, then narrowed with something that looked like a mixture of horror and opportunity. He knew he had discovered something that would change everything. I begged him to keep quiet, tried to explain that I was just studying comparative religion, attempted to convince him that it meant nothing serious. But Zaid had been raised in the same house I had, trained by the same father, taught the same lessons about honor and family reputation. He understood the magnitude of what he had witnessed, and he knew exactly what he was expected to do with this information. The next morning, during our family breakfast, as we sat around the low table sharing bread and olives, Zaid cleared his throat and spoke the words that would seal my fate. "Father," he said, his voice trembling with the weight of his announcement, "I saw Sister reading the Christian book last night. She was reading it like it was holy scripture, not just studying it for her classes." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person at that table understood immediately what this meant. My father's face went through a series of transformations: surprise, disbelief, rage, and finally, a cold, calculating fury that was more terrifying than any explosion of anger would have been. My mother dropped the piece of bread she was holding. My siblings stared at me as if I had suddenly grown horns. And I sat there, knowing that my double life was over and whatever came next would determine whether I lived or died. My father's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet and controlled, which somehow made it more frightening than if he had been shouting. "Daughter," he said, looking directly at me with eyes that showed no trace of the love I had once seen there, "show me this book that your brother mentions." I could have continued to lie. I could have denied everything, claimed Zaid was mistaken, insisted that I remained a faithful Muslim. But in that moment, I felt the same courage that had led me to pray that night on the rooftop. The Holy Spirit, though I didn't fully understand who he was yet, gave me strength to speak truth even when I knew it would cost me everything. I stood up from the table, walked to my room, and returned with the Bible. I placed it on the table in front of my father, and as I did, I said words that I knew would change my life forever. "Yes, Father, I have been reading the Christian Bible, and I have come to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that he died for my sins, and that he is the only way to heaven. I am no longer a Muslim. I am a Christian." What happened next was chaos. My mother began wailing as if someone had died. My brothers jumped to their feet, shouting accusations and curses. My sisters huddled together in terror. But my father remained seated, staring at me with an expression I had never seen before, complete rejection mixed with something that looked almost like grief. When the shouting died down, Father spoke again. His voice was steady, but there was finality in it that chilled me to the bone. "You are no longer my daughter," he said. "You are no longer welcome in this house. You have brought shame upon our family that can only be cleansed by your death. Tomorrow, the village council will decide your fate. But I already know what that fate will be because I will be the one to demand it." That night, I was locked in our storage room with no food, no water, and no hope of escape. I should have been terrified, and part of me was, but another part of me felt a peace that truly passed understanding. I spent those hours singing every Christian hymn I had learned, reciting every Bible verse I had memorized, and praying for my family, especially for my father, who I knew was about to commit murder in the name of God. At dawn, I was dragged from the storage room to face a council of 20 village elders, all men, all devoted Muslims, all personally loyal to my father. The proceedings were brief and predetermined. I was accused of apostasy, abandoning Islam for Christianity. The evidence was overwhelming: my own confession, the Bible found in my possession, testimony from my brother about my behavior. The sentence was equally clear: death by stoning, to be carried out immediately as a warning to others who might be tempted to abandon the true faith. As they bound my hands and led me to the execution site, I found myself thinking about Jesus' crucifixion. He too had been condemned by religious leaders who believed they were serving God. He too had been led away to die for claiming to be something his accusers found blasphemous. The comparison gave me strength to keep walking when my legs wanted to collapse, to keep breathing when my lungs wanted to stop working from fear. The pit had been dug at the edge of our village, deep enough that I couldn't climb out even if I weren't injured, wide enough to accommodate my body and all the stones that would be thrown. As they lowered me into that hole, I looked up and saw faces I had known my entire life: neighbors, teachers, shopkeepers, friends of my family, all gathered to watch me die. But instead of hatred, I felt compassion for them. They truly believed they were doing God's will. They thought that killing me would please Allah and protect their community from contamination. My father stepped forward first, holding a stone the size of his fist. He looked down at me in that pit, and for just a moment, I thought I saw love flicker in his eyes. But then he spoke, his voice carrying clearly to everyone gathered. "This woman was my daughter, but she is no daughter of mine any longer. She has chosen the way of infidels over the way of Allah. She has brought shame upon our family and corruption into our community. Let her death be a warning to anyone who would consider following her path." The first stone hit my forehead, opening a gash that immediately began bleeding into my eyes. The second struck my shoulder, sending waves of pain down my arm. The third, fourth, fifth followed quickly, each one finding its mark, each one driving me closer to unconsciousness. But even as the physical pain overwhelmed me, I found myself praying the words Jesus had spoken from the cross. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." By the time a dozen stones had been thrown, I was barely conscious. Blood was flowing from multiple wounds, my ribs were cracked, and I could feel my strength ebbing away. The crowd was still throwing stones, but I was no longer fully aware of the impacts. Everything was becoming gray and distant, like watching a terrible movie in which I was somehow both participant and observer. Then came the dirt. Shovel after shovel of earth was thrown into the pit, covering my legs, my torso, my chest. I tried to speak, to breathe, to call out, but the weight of the soil made it impossible. The last thing I remembered before losing consciousness completely was the sound of my mother crying somewhere above me, and my own voice, barely a whisper, saying, "Jesus, receive my spirit." What happened next I can only describe as a miracle, because there is no natural explanation for how I survived what should have killed me. I don't know how long I was unconscious, buried under dirt and stones in that pit. It could have been hours or days. Time had no meaning in that dark place between life and death. But somehow, impossibly, I began to wake up. My first sensation was suffocation. My mouth and nose were filled with dirt. My chest was compressed by the weight of soil and rocks, and every attempt to breathe brought more earth into my lungs. But along with the panic of suffocation came something else, a supernatural strength that seemed to flow through my broken body, giving me the power to move when movement should have been impossible. I began to claw my way upward, pushing through the dirt with hands that should have been too weak to function, using muscles that should have been too damaged to respond. Each movement was agony, but each movement also brought me closer to air, closer to light, closer to life. I don't remember making the decision to dig. My body seemed to be moving on its own, driven by a power that wasn't mine. When my hand finally broke through the surface and felt cool night air, I almost wept with relief. But getting my hand out was only the beginning. I still had to excavate my entire body from what had been intended as my grave. It took what felt like hours of desperate digging, but eventually I managed to pull myself completely out of that pit. I collapsed on the ground next to my intended grave, gasping for air, coughing up dirt and blood, marveling at the fact that I was alive. My body was broken, multiple fractures, deep cuts, internal injuries that should have been fatal, but I was breathing, conscious, and somehow able to move. Under the light of the moon, I could see the village in the distance, dark and silent. Everyone had gone home, confident that justice had been served and the threat to their religious purity had been eliminated. But I couldn't stay there. Even though I was barely able to walk, I knew I had to get as far away as possible before morning, when someone might come to check the execution site. Using broken branches as crutches, bleeding from dozens of wounds, I began the most difficult journey of my life, walking away from everything I had ever known toward an uncertain future that depended entirely on God's provision. I stumbled through the darkness for hours, following paths I barely remembered, driven by nothing but the desperate need to reach safety before my strength gave out completely. Just as dawn was breaking, I collapsed beside a road that led to a Christian village about 15 kilometers from my home. I had walked all night on broken bones and damaged organs, sustained by nothing but divine strength and stubborn determination to survive. That's where Miriam found me, the same Christian woman whose kindness to her sick baby had cost my sister a beating years earlier. She was traveling to the market when she saw what looked like a body beside the road. When she realized I was alive, when she saw the extent of my injuries, she didn't hesitate. She loaded me into her cart and took me to her home, even though helping me put her own family at risk. Miriam's family nursed me back to health over 3 months, never asking questions about what had happened, never demanding explanations for my injuries. They simply loved me, cared for me, and protected me while my body healed and my spirit recovered from the trauma. During those months, I grew stronger in my Christian faith, learning from people who lived out the love of Jesus in practical, daily ways. When I was finally strong enough to travel, arrangements were made through an underground network of Christians to get me safely out of the country. It was dangerous for everyone involved. Helping apostates escape is a crime punishable by death in many places. But these followers of Jesus risked everything to save someone they barely knew, because that's what love does. Love takes risks. Love makes sacrifices. Love chooses life over law, mercy over judgment, forgiveness over revenge. Today, I live in freedom in a country where I can worship Jesus openly, where I can read the Bible without fear, where I can share my testimony without risking death. I work with an organization that helps other women who have fled religious persecution, particularly those who have left Islam to follow Christ. Every day, I meet women whose stories echo my own, women who discovered that Jesus is not just a prophet, but the Son of God, women who chose truth over tradition and paid an enormous price for that choice. The scars on my body are permanent reminders of that day in the pit. I have a scar on my forehead where the first stone struck, marks on my arms and shoulders where rocks found their target, and internal injuries that still cause me pain on difficult days. But every scar is also a testimony to God's faithfulness, evidence of His power to preserve life when death seems certain, proof of His ability to bring beauty from ashes. People often ask me if I hate my family, if I'm angry at my father for trying to kill me, if I want revenge against the community that buried me alive. The answer is always the same: no. I don't hate them. I love them. I pray for them every day. I forgive them because Christ first forgave me. That's the difference between my old religion and my new life. Islam taught me that love was conditional, that it had to be earned through perfect obedience. Christianity showed me that love is unconditional, given freely by a God who knew all my sins before I was born and chose to save me anyway. My father genuinely believed he was serving God when he threw that first stone. My brother thought he was protecting our family's honor when he reported my conversion. My neighbors were convinced they were defending their faith when they participated in my execution. They were wrong, but they were sincere. And Jesus died for sincere but misguided people just as much as He died for obvious sinners. Do I wish things had been different? Do I wish my family had responded with love instead of violence when I told them about Jesus? Of course. But I've learned that God can use even the worst circumstances to accomplish His purposes. My stoning became the foundation of my testimony. My near death became proof of His power. My rejection by an earthly family led to adoption into God's eternal family. I share my story not to condemn Islam or promote hatred toward Muslims, but to testify to the saving power of Jesus Christ. If He can love someone like me, someone who was literally stoned and left for dead for following Him, He can love anyone. If He can save someone who was raised to hate Christianity, He can save anyone. If He can transform a life as broken as mine was, He can transform any life. The stones they threw at me became stepping stones to a new life. What they meant for evil, God used for good. What was intended to silence my voice became the very thing that gave me a story worth telling. What should have ended my life became the beginning of real living. Every breath I take is borrowed time, a gift from the God who specializes in resurrection. Every day I live is a testimony to His faithfulness. Every scar on my body is evidence of His miraculous power. Every story I tell is proof that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I want you to understand something crucial about the God I serve now versus the God I served before. Allah demanded submission but offered distant mercy. Jesus offers relationship and guarantees unconditional love. Allah required perfect obedience to earn favor. Jesus gives favor freely and then transforms hearts to desire obedience. Allah's love came with conditions that could never be fully met. Jesus' love comes with no conditions except acceptance of the gift He's already paid for. When I was a Muslim, I prayed 5 times a day, but never felt heard. When I pray to Jesus, I know He's listening before I speak. When I was a Muslim, I followed rules hoping to avoid punishment. As a Christian, I followed Jesus because he first loved me and continues to love me regardless of my failures. When I was a Muslim, heaven seemed like something I might earn if I was perfect enough. As a Christian, heaven is my guaranteed inheritance because Jesus was perfect on my behalf. But this transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't easy. The first few years after my escape were filled with nightmares, panic attacks, and deep depression. I had lost everything: my family, my culture, my language, my homeland, my identity, as I had known it for 18 years. Even though I had found Jesus, even though I knew I had made the right choice, the grief was overwhelming. There were nights when I would wake up screaming, reliving the sensation of stones hitting my body, feeling the weight of dirt being shoveled over me, hearing my father's voice declaring me dead. There were days when the loneliness was so intense I wondered if dying in that pit might have been easier than living with the constant ache of rejection and isolation. There were moments when I questioned whether Jesus was worth losing everything else I had ever known or loved. But in every dark moment, he was there. When the nightmares came, he reminded me that he too had suffered rejection by his own people. When loneliness overwhelmed me, he showed me that he had been abandoned by his closest friends when he needed them most. When I felt like dying would be easier, he whispered to my heart that he had died, so I could truly live. When I wondered if following him was worth the cost, he reminded me that he had counted the cost of saving me and decided I was worth his life. Slowly, gradually, he began to heal not just my body but my heart and mind as well. He brought Christian families into my life, who became the family I had lost. He gave me meaningful work helping other women who had walked similar paths. He surrounded me with a community of believers who celebrated my testimony instead of being ashamed of my past. He turned my pain into purpose, my wounds into weapons against the darkness, my brokenness into a platform for his glory. Through a network of believers, Jamila was able to get a Bible and began reading it secretly, just as I had done years earlier. Like me, she was struck by the difference between the God she found in the Gospels and the Allah she had been taught to fear. Like me, she began to experience the love and peace that come only from a relationship with Jesus Christ. And like me, she eventually made the decision to follow Jesus regardless of the cost. But Jamila's story was different from mine in one crucial way. She didn't have to face her conversion alone. By the time she was ready to leave Islam, there was an established network of people ready to help her escape safely. She didn't have to survive a stoning or claw her way out of a grave. She was able to leave quietly, secretly, and find safety before her family discovered her decision. Today, Jamila lives in the same city I do. We work together, helping other women make the same journey we've made. We often talk about how God used my terrible experience to create the support system that saved her life. If I hadn't been stoned, if I hadn't nearly died, if I hadn't escaped and shared my story, the network that helped her might never have existed. My pain became her pathway to freedom. But the most miraculous part of my story is yet to come. 3 years ago, I received a phone call that changed everything. It was from a Christian worker in my home country who said he had been contacted by someone claiming to be my brother Zaid. The same brother who had discovered my Bible, who had reported me to my father, who had stood in that crowd and watched me be stoned. According to the message, Zaid wanted to meet with me. He had something urgent to tell me, something that couldn't be communicated through intermediaries. After much prayer and counsel from other believers, I agreed to meet him in a safe location in a neutral country. When I saw Zaid for the first time in over 20 years, I barely recognized him. The teenage boy who had been so eager to earn our father's approval had become a man carrying a weight of guilt so heavy it had bent his shoulders and aged his face beyond his years. When he saw me, he fell to his knees and wept like a child. "Sister," he said through his tears, "I have been haunted by what I did to you every day for 23 years. I thought I was serving God when I reported your conversion, but I've watched what happened to our family afterward, and I know now that I was serving something evil instead." He told me that after my stoning, our father had become increasingly extreme in his religious views, demanding absolute perfection from everyone in the family. Our mother had fallen into a depression, so deep she rarely spoke or left her room. Our siblings had lived in constant fear of making any mistake that might be seen as spiritual weakness. The joy had completely left our house, replaced by a fear so pervasive that family gatherings became exercises in religious performance rather than expressions of love. But the most devastating part of Zaid's confession was yet to come. "Father never got over what happened to you," he said. "He began having nightmares about the stoning, dreams where you called out to him for help and he ignored you. He started questioning whether Allah would really be pleased by a father killing his daughter. The religious certainty that had once defined him began to crumble, and he became consumed with doubt and regret. 6 months after my stoning, our father had suffered what appeared to be a complete mental breakdown. He stopped leading prayers at the mosque, stopped teaching Islamic law, stopped participating in community religious activities. He would sit for hours staring at the place in our courtyard where he had announced my sentence, muttering prayers for forgiveness that never seemed to bring him peace. 5 years after my stoning, Hakim, the man who had thrown the first stone at his own daughter, died of what the doctors called a heart attack, but what everyone in the family knew was really a broken heart. His last words, according to Zaid, were a whispered apology to a daughter who wasn't there to hear it. When Zaid finished telling me about our father's death, he looked at me with eyes full of desperate hope and asked the question that had brought him across continents to find me. "Sister, can you ever forgive me for what I did? Can the Jesus you follow forgive someone who caused so much pain? Is there any hope for someone like me who has blood on his hands?" I looked at my brother, this man who had been responsible for the worst day of my life, whose actions had led to years of pain and trauma, who had set in motion events that eventually killed our father, and I felt something I never expected to feel. Love. Not just forgiveness, but genuine, overwhelming love for the broken man kneeling before me. "Zaid," I said, taking his hands in mine, "of course I forgive you. I forgave you years ago. And yes, Jesus can forgive you too. That's what he does. That's who he is. The same Jesus who forgave the soldiers who crucified him, who forgave the thief hanging next to him on the cross, who forgave me for years of rejecting him. That same Jesus is ready to forgive you right now if you ask him to." Right there, in a small hotel room in a neutral country, my brother gave his life to Jesus Christ. The same brother who had once betrayed me became my brother in faith, as well as blood. The person whose actions had nearly killed me became a fellow heir in God's kingdom. The betrayer became the beloved. Salma is now also a Christian, living safely in Europe and working as a nurse. She says that watching me choose potential death over denial of my faith planted seeds in her heart that took years to grow, but eventually produced the same fruit, a decision to follow Jesus regardless of the cost. 3 of the 7 children from our Islamic family are now Christians. 3 people who were raised to hate Christianity, who were taught that Muslims who convert deserve death, who witnessed firsthand the price that conversion can exact, and all 3 of us chose Jesus anyway. That's not a coincidence. That's the power of the gospel to transform hearts and change lives in ways that human logic cannot explain. Our mother is still alive, still living in the same house where I grew up, still mourning the loss of 3 children to what she considers a foreign religion. Through Zaid, she sends messages occasionally, not of reconciliation, but of continued grief for the daughters and son she considers dead. I pray for her every day, hoping that someday she too will discover the love that was worth losing everything to find. My oldest brother Tariq has followed completely in our father's footsteps, becoming an even more extreme Islamic leader than Hakim ever was. He preaches regularly about the dangers of Christianity and the importance of maintaining Islamic purity in families and communities. He uses our family story as a cautionary tale, warning parents about the signs of apostasy to watch for in their children. In his version of events, I am the villain who destroyed our family's honor, and my death was the righteous judgment of Allah that was somehow thwarted by evil forces. But I pray for Tariq too, because I know that his extremism often comes from the same place mine once did, a desperate desire to please God and earn salvation through perfect religious performance. I know how exhausting that kind of faith can be, how empty and fearful and hopeless it ultimately becomes. I pray that someday he too will discover that salvation is a gift, not a wage, and that God's love doesn't have to be earned because it's already been freely given. This is why I share my story. Not to condemn Islam or promote hatred toward Muslims, but to testify to the life-changing power of Jesus Christ. Not to encourage religious conflict, but to demonstrate that God's love is stronger than human hatred, that His grace is more powerful than our sin, that His forgiveness extends even to those who stone His children. I want every person listening to understand that no matter what you've done, no matter how far you've strayed from God, no matter how unforgivable your sins might seem, Jesus loves you and wants to save you. If He can forgive a Muslim girl who turned her back on everything her family held sacred, He can forgive you. If He can save someone who was literally buried alive for following Him, He can save you. If He can transform a family tragedy into a testimony of hope, He can transform your life too. The stones that were meant to end my life became the foundation of my ministry. The pit that was meant to be my grave became the starting point of my real life. The family rejection that was meant to silence me became the reason I can speak with authority about the cost and worth of following Jesus. But I also want to be clear about something. Following Jesus doesn't mean your life will be easy. It doesn't mean you won't face persecution, rejection, or loss. It doesn't mean that everyone will understand your decision or support your faith. What it means is that whatever you face, you won't face it alone. Whatever you lose, you'll gain something infinitely more valuable. Whatever persecution comes, it's temporary, but the life Jesus offers is eternal. When I was lying in that pit, broken and bleeding and buried alive, I thought my life was over. I thought my story had ended in tragedy, that my faith had cost me everything and gained me nothing. But God was writing a different ending, one I couldn't see from the bottom of that grave. He was preparing to turn my testimony into a tool for His glory, my wounds into weapons against darkness, my brokenness into a platform for His healing power. That's what God does. He takes the worst things that happen to us and transforms them into the most powerful parts of our testimony. He uses our deepest pain to create our greatest ministry. He turns our scars into stars, our messes into messages, our tests into testimonies. Today, I stand before you not as a victim, but as a victor. Not as someone who lost everything, but as someone who gained something worth more than everything I lost. Not as a woman destroyed by religious violence, but as a woman transformed by divine love. Not as someone to be pitied, but as someone whose life demonstrates that Jesus Christ is indeed the resurrection and the life. I am living proof that when Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," He meant it literally. I am walking evidence that when He promised, "Whoever believes in me will live, even though they die," He was speaking absolute truth. I am breathing testimony to the fact that greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends, and Jesus considers each of us His friend. So, I ask you today, what is keeping you from following Jesus? What fear, what shame, what past sin, what family pressure, what social expectation is preventing you from accepting the love He offers? Whatever it is, I promise you it's not worth rejecting Him. Whatever you think you might lose by following Jesus, I guarantee you'll gain something immeasurably better. Whatever price you're afraid you might have to pay, remember that He already paid the ultimate price for you. The same Jesus who raised me from a grave of stones and dirt wants to raise you from whatever grave of sin, shame, fear, or despair you might be in right now. The same power that sustained me through stoning and burial is available to sustain you through whatever challenges you're facing. The same love that transformed my family tragedy into a testimony of hope can transform your life into something beautiful and meaningful and eternal. Don't wait for a perfect time or perfect circumstances. Don't wait until you feel worthy or ready. Don't wait until you have all your questions answered or all your problems solved. Come to Jesus exactly as you are, with all your doubts and fears and failures, and let Him do what only He can do. Make you into a new creation, give you a new heart, offer you a new life. This is my testimony. This is my story. This is why I will never stop telling the world about the love that saved me, the grace that transformed me, and the Jesus who proved that not even death itself can separate us from God's love. The stones they threw at me became stepping stones to a new life. And if God can do that for me, He can do anything for you. If you've been touched by this story today, if something in your heart is stirring, if you feel God calling you to follow Jesus, don't ignore that call. That's the Holy Spirit speaking to your soul, inviting you into the same relationship that changed my life forever. Respond to that call. Accept that invitation. Choose life. Choose love. Choose Jesus. And if you're already a Christian but you've been hiding your faith, if you've been afraid to share what Jesus means to you, let my story give you courage. Yes, following Jesus can be costly, but not following Him is infinitely more costly. Yes, some people might reject you for your faith, but God will never reject you because of your faith. Yes, you might lose some things you value, but you'll gain something worth more than everything you could possibly lose. The world needs to hear testimonies like mine. People who are trapped in religious systems that offer rules without relationship, who are exhausted by trying to earn God's love, who are desperate for the kind of peace and joy and hope that only Jesus can provide. They need to hear that there's a better way. They need to know that God's love is unconditional, that salvation is a gift, that relationship with Him is possible. So share your story. Tell people what Jesus has done in your life. Don't be ashamed of the gospel, because it really is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. Don't hide your light under a bushel, because there are people walking in darkness who desperately need to see the light you carry. My name is Maha, and I am a living testament to the resurrection power of Jesus Christ. I was stoned for my faith, buried alive for following Him, and raised from the dead by His miraculous power. And if you believe in Him, if you trust in Him, if you follow Him, then you too are a living testament to His power, His love, and His grace. Let's make sure the world knows who He is and what He's done, not just in ancient history, but in our lives today. Let's make sure our testimonies become tools in His hands to reach other people who are exactly where we used to be, lost, hopeless, trapped, and desperate for the kind of love that transforms everything. This is why I live. This is why I survived. This is why I share my story. Because Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and what He did for me, He wants to do for you too. Before I finish, I want to ask you to do a few things. If this testimony has touched your heart, if it's helped you in some way, please let me know by hitting the like button. I'd love to hear from you in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe you know someone who's questioning their faith, someone who's struggling with religious legalism, someone who feels trapped by family expectations or cultural pressure. Maybe you know someone who thinks they're too far gone for God's love to reach them. Share this story with them, because it might be exactly what they need to hear today. And please subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because I have so many more testimonies to share with you. Stories of other women who've escaped religious persecution, accounts of miraculous rescues and divine interventions, testimonies of God's faithfulness in the darkest circumstances. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of these powerful stories. I also want to encourage you to go back and watch the previous testimonies shared on this channel. Each one is different, but they all point to the same truth, that Jesus Christ is Lord, that His love is unconditional, and that no one is beyond the reach of His saving grace. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for allowing me to share my heart with you today. May God bless you richly as you seek to follow Him with your whole heart, and may you never forget that you too have a testimony that could change someone's life forever. God bless you all.